Here at Squiz Kids, you probably know that we're on something of a media literacy crusade. Our Newshounds classroom resource teaches kids how to think critically about the flood of information they're exposed to each day online. It teaches them how to spot misinformation and separate online fact from fiction. Since launch, more than 4,000 primary school teachers around the country have signed up to do Newshounds with their classes. Because it's free, because it's fun, because it's curriculum aligned, and because it works. But unless we get government funding to continue Newshounds, we may have to shut it down. With the federal election looming, we need your help. If you think digital and media literacy is an important life skill our kids should be learning at school, sign our petition at change.org. The link is in the episode notes, or you can find it on our website squizkids.com.au. Send a message to Canberra. Help us help the next generation.
This is a Squiz Kids podcast. Your fresh take on what's happening in the world around you.
He robbed banks, saved and took lives, and threw parties for his hostages. This is your Squiz Kids Shortcut to Ned Kelly, the podcast where we dive into the who, what, when, where, why and how of the big news stories. I'm Amanda Bauer.
And I'm Bryce Corbett.
Bryce, we have been talking a lot at Squiz Kids lately about media literacy, about how to stop, think and check if something you see or hear or read is true.
Yep.
And one of the things that our mate Squizzy the Newshound has learned is that two people who are in exactly the same place at exactly the same time can have a very different version of what actually happened.
Oh, yes.
So the story of Ned Kelly is a great example of that. Some people see him as a hero, a kind of Australian Robin Hood, and others see him as a murderous criminal.
Yep.
He's inspired some of our country's most famous art, and he was the subject of the world's first feature-length film.
I didn't know that.
Have a look at the links in your episode notes.
Today, we'll take you through how Ned Kelly became Australia's most wanted bushranger, why so many people thought of him as a hero, and what his metal armour was all about.
Listen carefully. There's a quiz at the end.
Who?
Edward Kelly was born in Beveridge, Victoria in either 1854 or 1855. His precise date of birth isn't known. His dad, John Kelly, was sent from Ireland to Australia as a convict for stealing pigs. Once John had served his time, he decided to stay.
And, Amanda, what kind of a kid was Ned?
Well, we don't know a lot, but we do know that when he was just 10 years old, Ned saved another kid from drowning.
Oh.
The boy's family awarded Ned with a green silk sash for his bravery. Now, he was wearing that sash when he was finally captured as a bushranger.
Oh,
so
wow.
I think it's fair to say that he was pretty proud of having saved that life.
Yeah, clearly. So, at the age of 10, Ned saved a life, and yet a few years later, he was involved in killing of police. What changed?
Well, when Ned was only 12, his dad died and he began to spend more time with his uncles who were not exactly law-abiding citizens. And when he was 14, Ned came under the influence of a bushranger called Harry Powers.
And what exactly is a bushranger?
Well, back then it meant a convict who had escaped and was hiding in the bush.
Right.
The bushrangers survived by stealing and robbing, and the Kelly family actually supported Harry Powers.
And why would they do that?
Well, convicts were often treated terribly, so some people didn't blame them for escaping. Ned's family was known to support and protect people who were on the run, and Ned basically became Harry's apprentice. He started helping Harry Powers steal horses and commit robberies.
But wait a second, he was only 14?
Yeah, I mean, 14-year-olds definitely had more responsibilities back then than most kids do today, and maybe Ned was more mature than your average year 9.
Right. Wow.
But the situation raises some important questions. I mean, was Ned too young to really think for himself about joining Harry Powers?
Right.
And if most of the adults around you are breaking the law, how hard is it to say no and do the right thing?
Good point.
Whatever your opinion, there's no doubt that from the age of 14, Ned was on the Victorian Police's wanted list.
Wow. And how old was Ned when he was first arrested?
He was only 15,
Oh,
and by
wow.
the time he was 17, he'd actually been to prison twice.
Gosh.
But the point of no return in his journey came when Ned was 23 in what is called the Fitzpatrick incident.
Right.
And it is the perfect example, Bryce, of how two completely different stories can be told about the same events.
Oh, yeah, I remember this. A police officer called Alexander Fitzpatrick came to the Kellys' house and wound up injured. But those are just about the only details that Fitzpatrick and the Kellys agree on.
Yeah, exactly right. So the police officer's version of the story is that he had come to arrest Dan Kelly, Ned's brother.
Yep.
And he wound up shot by Ned and knocked unconscious by Ned's mother, Ellen.
Oh.
The Kellys' version is that the police officer Fitzpatrick had arrived drunk, he had no paperwork to arrest Dan, and then he'd behaved inappropriately towards Ned and Dan's sister, Kate. They said that's what caused them to fight with him, and the police officer's injury occurred when they were defending their sister.
And the judge agreed with the police officer's version of events, right?
He did, and actually that was even though the head of the police had actually described Alexander Fitzpatrick as generally bad and a discredit to the police force.
Wow. And what happened then?
Well, Ned and Dan went on the run, and Ellen, their mother, was actually sentenced to 6 months of hard labour for knocking Fitzpatrick unconscious with a shovel.
Oh, wow. Ouch.
Members of the public were outraged that an older woman would be sentenced to hard physical work.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of sympathy for the Kelly brothers, who were called bushrangers even though they weren't escaped convicts.
Yep.
The Kelly gang started stealing, but they said it was to pay for a lawyer to appeal their mum's sentence.
And so I'm guessing that's one reason why many people thought of Ned Kelly as a hero.
Why?
There's no doubt, Bryce, that Ned Kelly was a criminal. He killed 3 police officers, he robbed 2 banks, and some people were really afraid of him.
Right.
But he did have his sympathisers. In fact, the police got so frustrated that people were helping the Kelly gang to avoid capture that they started putting people in prison for months without charging them if they suspected that they were aiding the Kellys. Ned talked about police harassment of people like him and also about the bad treatment of the Irish in Australia as he saw it.
And is that the 56-page letter left behind when the Kellys robbed a bank in Jerilderie?
That's it. Can you imagine writing a 56-page letter?
That's a lot of pages.
Well, you'd have to feel really strongly, and that's exactly obviously what Ned did. He said in the letter that he acted in self-defence when he killed those police officers. So once again, we have a case of there being very different versions of the same event.
Right.
He also wrote really passionately about how badly he thought poor people in colonial Australia were being treated. In fact, when Ned robbed that bank in Jerilderie, he also burned all the bank's paperwork on who owed the money so that those people wouldn't have to pay the bank back.
And that's why some people think of Ned as an Australian Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and helping the poor. Now, Amanda, you said earlier that Ned even threw a party for his hostages. Is that really true?
Well, when the Kelly gang robbed their first bank, they didn't hurt anyone. All the locals were put into a storeroom, and there are stories that the Kellys put on a horse trick riding show for them, and that they even had a drink with the bank manager before they rode away with all the bank's money.
How very civilised.
And in a place called Glenrowan, the Kellys took the entire town hostage at the local inn, and there were drinks and dancing.
Wow. Now, Glenrowan, that is a familiar name. Isn't that where Ned Kelly was finally captured?
That is exactly right. Maybe they were having a little too much fun in that party at the end because Ned allowed one local to leave and he alerted the police. The police surrounded the Glenrowan Inn and they were actually terrified when Ned came out because he looked more like a machine than a man.
Ah, yes, Ned Kelly's famous metal armour. Now, what was that all about?
What?
All 4 members of the Kelly gang had made themselves bulletproof armour out of pieces of metal ploughs that were used on farms.
Wow.
I'll put a really great video in your episode notes showing how the armour looked and worked. It was like nothing anyone had seen before, and when Ned came out of the Glenrowan Inn, a journalist wrote about it this way.
There was no head visible, and in the dim light of morning, with the steam rising from the ground, it looked for all the world like the ghost of Hamlet's father, with no head, only a very thick neck. The figure continued gradually to advance, stopping every now and then, and moving what looked like its headless neck mechanically around, and then raising one foot onto a log and aiming and firing a revolver. Shot after shot was fired at it, but without effect.
Bullets bounced off Ned's armour multiple times, so the armour worked, but he had 2 big problems. First of all, the armour was extremely heavy, so he couldn't get away. And second, it didn't cover the bottom half of his body. So the police finally hit him in the legs and captured him.
Bit of a design fault.
Yeah. And the rest of his gang was killed.
Wow.
Ned was taken to prison and he was sentenced to hang to death.
Ah, yes. And just before he died, didn't Ned famously say, "Such is life"?
Well, that's what some newspapers reported at the time.
Oh.
But actually, Ned decided not to make a speech before he died, and most witnesses said that his final words were mumbled and something like, "Oh, well, I suppose." He was probably just answering a question that someone had asked him, but "such is life" was what one reporter came up with, and everyone else thought that was pretty great and a lot more interesting, so that's what they went with.
Ah, history.
We will never know exactly what Ned said. We will never know the truth of many of the things that he did. But we do know that at the age of either 25 or 26, Ned Kelly died for his crimes.
Now, perhaps because so many questions are still unanswered, Ned Kelly remains one of the most fascinating people in Australian history.
Time for the quiz.
This is the part of the podcast where you get to test how well you've been listening. Question number 1. What did the Kelly gang use to make their armour? Yeah, that's right. It was metal parts of a plough.
Question number 2. Ned Kelly was wearing something on the day he was captured that he got when he was just 10. What was it? That's right. It was a green silk sash that he won for bravery.
Question number 3. What do you think? Was Ned Kelly a goodie, a baddie, or something more complicated? Of course, there's no right answer to that, but it's sure to start some good conversations amongst you.
I think so too. That's all we have time for today. Thanks for joining us as we explored the who, what, how, where, when and why of Ned Kelly.
Now get out there and have a most excellent day.
Over and out. These episodes are edited and engineered by Carter Quinn.